Welcome, everyone. It's nice to see so many familiar faces, or at least their names, from not only New York City, but many different parts of the US and even beyond. So welcome to our event this afternoon. We are happy to have a wonderful set of panelists to discuss protests and repression in contemporary Iran. I'm just the really the moderator here this afternoon, but let me just say a few brief words before I introduce our panelists. For those of you who have followed Iranian politics for several decades, you'll know that protests are not a new phenomena in post-revolutionary Iran. And for about a quarter of a century, in fact, Iranians have taken to the streets in many different ways. They've protested against their employers, against banks, and against a wide array of local and national political decision makers. They have congregated outside governmental buildings, taken to the streets. They've signed various petitions demanding better work conditions, better pay, protection of their pensions and their savings, and many, many other things. As the whole world found out in 2009, many Iranians were willing to take to the streets to protest the election results of that year. But they've also engaged in street protests to challenge decisions, for instance, to divide provinces or to block attempts to create independent unions. However, despite all of this contentious politics in Iran's kind of modern history or in contemporary history, in the past 4 or 5 years, there's been a dramatic shift. The changes that we see in protests are quite noticeable. There's a change. There's kind of an expansion in the geographic scope of protests. They've truly become national in many senses. There's been an intensity in the rage on display by the protesters, and they've become more regularized kind of episodes that occur seemingly almost every year or even every month. Finally, the tone and implications of the chants have escalated, and the targets have become more varied and have included the highest echelons of the Islamic Republic. And simultaneously, the state's response to protests have also become more pronounced. The state has become more uncompromising and has been more willing to mete out violence against dissident voices. Now, there are many different ways to explain these transformations, including the intensification of poverty and inequality due to various reasons, including international sanctions, but also the demise of the reformist movement and the decline of institutionalized politics has been a factor of recent years. And finally, there have been developments in telecommunications and social media that for some people have contributed to the proliferation of protests. To help us parse out these many factors and comprehend the various forces that have both energized different sectors of Iranian society and shaped the calculations of the coercive apparatus of the regime of the Islamic Republic, we've assembled a wonderful set of researchers here for you today. And what I'm just going to do is briefly introduce them, and then I will hand the floor over to our Peyman Jafari. So let me start with Peyman, who is currently a postdoctoral research associate at Princeton University. His research interests include the relationship between oil and global capitalism, labor history and politics, social movements and revolutions. He is currently working on a book project on oil and labor in the making of the Iranian Revolution. Our first panelist is Narges Bajoghli, who is an award-winning anthropologist and writer. She's an assistant professor of Middle Eastern Studies at the School of Advanced Studies at Johns Hopkins University. Her research focuses on the intersection of power and media production. Her first book, Iran Reframed, Anxieties of Power in the Islamic Republic, was published in 2019 by Stanford University Press and was based on years of ethnographic research in Iran on media producers in the Revolutionary Guard Corps, as well as the Basij paramilitary organization. It has received several awards, including the Margaret Mead Award from the American Anthropological Association and the Society of Applied Anthropology. I'm very happy to say that she received her PhD in the anthropology department here at New York University. And last but not least, I'm happy to introduce Ali Kadivar, who is an assistant professor of sociology and international studies at Boston College. Utilizing a mixed method approach, Kadivar's work examines the emergence and consequences of protest movements in Iran, in the Middle East, and globally. Kadivar's academic research has been published in several academic journals, such as the American Sociological Review, Comparative Politics, Social Forces, and Mobilization. Kadivar has also published shorter analyses and op-eds, both in Persian and in English, in outlets such as Washington Post, Foreign Affairs, and BBC Persian. So please join me in welcoming our panelists, and Peyman is going to start the conversation.
Okay, thank you, Arang, for your kind introduction, and also thanks for Ali Mirsapasi for initiating this panel, and also to Sahar Soleimani for kind assistance with organizing this. So before starting the conversation with our panelists, I just want to give a brief overview of the protests of the last few years for those who are less familiar with the Iranian context. On November 15 last year, the government's sudden announcement of a gas price hike by up to 300% triggered a wave of protests that started in Khuzestan and then spread to the rest of the country very rapidly. Tens of thousands of people joined demonstrations in over 100 towns and cities, blocking highways in many places. There were also instances of burning down gas stations, banks, and government buildings. Although the price hike had been the main trigger, the slogans of the protests reflected a wide spectrum of social and political grievances, including structural corruption and state repression. In towns in Kurdistan and Khuzestan particularly, ethnic marginalization fed into the protests as well. In order to gain control over the protests, the government shut down internet connections, and the Supreme National Security Council ordered providers to switch over to the nationwide intranet. But most importantly, the state unleashed a bloody crackdown on the protests, killing at least 304 people, according to Amnesty International, in early December. So these November or Aban protests, as Iranians call them, are very similar to the protests that emerged in December 2017 and January 2018. Those protests started in Mashhad on December 28th of 2018. And although factional politics played an important role in those protests, the spread of the protests to dozens of other cities reflected really the widespread anger against rapidly increasing inflation, but I would say economic deterioration in general. But also then, economic and political grievances merged, as many protesters were shouting death to dictator and were targeting the government as well as the supreme leader, Ayatollah Khamenei. Now we know that protests are not a new phenomenon in Iran, as Arang just explained as well. There have been urban revolts in the early 1990s. We have had strikes by bus drivers, by teachers, by the workers of Haftapeh, and we have had, of course, the Green Movement of 2009. Nevertheless, I think the protests of the last few years are different than the previous ones in terms of intensity, social composition, and action repertoires. The intensity of the protests is partially the outcome of the accumulation of grievances about structural problems in Iran. I'm referring here to widespread corruption, economic mismanagement, concentration of power in conglomerates that are exempt from taxation and oversight, the unraveling of the post-revolutionary social contract due to free market reforms, and not to forget the authoritarian institutions that undermine and limit popular participation. So these structural factors have caused, in my view at least, a dual crisis of legitimacy and capacity. But these problems have been a constant factor, as we know, in the last 4 decades of the Islamic Republic. What makes the last few years particularly intense and different is the existence of the maximum pressure politics of the Trump administration. The US sanctions have devastated the Iranian economy. You don't have to take my word for it. Let me quote from Pompeo's statement of November 18th. So here it comes. The maximum pressure campaign against the Iranian regime continues to be extraordinarily effective. Note, effective. Today, Iran's economy faces a currency crisis, mounting public debt, and rising inflation. The Iranian rial has depreciated to 1/5 of its former value against the dollar since the start of the campaign, while Iran's GDP has shrunk by around 6% for 3 consecutive years. So I think both the domestic factors and the international factors have to be included in our overall analysis if we want to make sense of what has been happening in Iran with the protests. And moreover, the protests in Iran are, of course, not isolated. I think they are part of the broader picture of regional and global upsurge of protests in which the demand for social justice resonates very, very strongly. What I have tried to do with this brief interview is just to provide really the context for the panelists to delve into more details. So I want to start the conversation with them now in 2 rounds. So I start with more specific questions related to the work research that they have done. And in the second part, I move to more general questions, trying to make sense of how the protests fit within the overall political developments in Iran. In 2009, the political was much more at the foreground, and then in the last few years, at least as triggers, the economic issues were more at the foreground. So, and you have also researched both the composition of the movement, the protests, their distribution in nationwide, the different districts, etc., looking particularly to the role of the middle class and lower class participants in both Tehran and the provinces. So what do you make of this composition, and what can we say differentiates these protests from earlier cycles of protest?
Thank you, Peyman, for your great question, and thank you for having me on this great panel. So as you mentioned, there is something unique about these 2 waves of protest, the Imah and Aban-Mah, and that is the geographic widespread. That's what Arang also mentioned. So if we counted by the number of shahristans or counties, there are between 80 to 90 counties had protests, both in Aban and in Day. Overall, Iran right now has over 430 something shahristan. In the last census of 2016, this was 429. So this, we can use this variation in the terms of counties that had protests and counties that did not have protests to look at some of the correlation between protests and other socioeconomic indicators. This can open a window for us to learn more about these 2 waves of protest. It's an interesting approach. It, of course, has its own limitations, but it can help us to, for example, answer your question to an extent. So I want to make a distinction between these 2 waves of protest. There are similarities that you mentioned: anti-regime tone, intensity, what I call unarmed violence, such as attacking police, burning police cars, banks, and so on, and slogans against the regime, against the clergy, against the foreign policy of the regime. When it comes to the analysis, I've looked at both of these 2 waves differently, and I say what I have found. So for the Imah, I have been working now on this for 3 years. This paper is not published. But what I find, the 2 most strong predictors of which counties had protests in the Imah are 2 things. One is the size of population. Bigger counties had protests. This is not surprising when you run a statistical model on protest events. Bigger cities have more population. It's more likely for dissidents to get together and have the critical mass necessary for a wave of protest. The other strong predictor for protests in the Imah was digital coordination. So I have, with one of my colleagues and student at Boston College, Abulfazl Sutude, we looked at all of the Instagram posts that use the hashtags related for that wave of protest. Hashtags such as اعتراضات سراسری، تظاهرات سراسری، اعتصابات سراسری. We looked at 2 different hashtags. We downloaded 41,000 posts. And there are calls for protest in this post. There are about 1,600 calls for protest. And those calls for protest specify the name of a county on the next day, and for example, a square or certain location and a time. And these happen to be a strong predictor of which counties had protests and which counties did not have protests. The most famous digital account that was active in that period was Ahmad News, which got a lot of media attention. A government went after Zam, the administrator, who has been sentenced to death, unfortunately. But our analysis shows that this was not the only account. There were more than 200 accounts that sent those calls for protests on Instagram. And Instagram was not the only platform. Telegram was also active, but Telegram was filtered, and Ahmad News was filtered on the 3rd, but Instagram was open. And among these users that send these calls for protest, what I found that is not something that maybe we wanted to find, but it makes sense. The accounts with most number of users were monarchist accounts. And in Deimah, we also heard slogans in support of monarchy. Many of us did not like to hear those calls, but sometimes our research lead us to findings that is not necessarily what we would like to see. But this makes sense with the kind of slogans we heard in that wave of protest. In Aban Mah, there were some pro-monarchies, but it was much less. And I think with this comparison, it becomes a bit more obvious, because in Aban Mah, internet was down, so naturally we don't have digital coordination. And I think it would be interesting to think why these users got such a central position in digital coordination in Deimah. Again, from what we know, the first day was not digitally coordinated. From the informal news that we know, hardliners were behind the first day of protest. I think what happens was that these accounts on the first day when protests broke out, put out these calls for protest. There was heightened attention, and there have been grievances shaped by different factors. We know that, for example, the users of Ahmad News Telegram channel went from 500,000 to over 1 million users. This shows that this process is happening at the time. So I think these users were able to coordinate that wave of protests at that period. It doesn't mean that they would have the power to do so again, because they tried when, for example, the dollar price was going up and gold was going up. It was not successful later. But this also shows that I think there was an important political coordination factor in place in the protest. In Avan protest, again, if I want to single out 2 most important predictors, again, population size is important. More populous counties had protests. I think top 10, 15 populous counties in Iran all had 1 day of protest. The second thing that is even statistically meaningful, powerful, and the size of the effect is also important, which I published this in an article in Foreign Affairs that, again, I had written with my colleagues at Boston College last year, is the electoral turnout in 2017 election. The counties that lower turnout were more likely to have protests. We can take turnout, electoral turnout, for how much faith citizens have in the institutional politics of the regime. When citizens have some hope that they can push for their grievances and their demands through institutional politics, specifically electoral politics, they are probably more likely to pursue that through institutional channels and not resort to protest. But I think what has happened is that this kind of the lack of faith in institutional politics, it existed before, but it was not politicized in this form. And these are, I think, the factors that were in place from 2017 to 2019. So the economic situation certainly deteriorated, high inflation, higher unemployment, the power of households to buy and expend certainly declined. I think this politicized these grievances that we see in Aban Mah, in the month of Aban, led to protest. So what I observed there again is an important political factor, which Arang also mentions, a decline in the institutions of regime, institutions for political participation, and politicization of this belief that I cannot, as a citizen, pursue my demand through the channels of institutional politics.
Thank you, Ali. If I can add another question to this, because you pointed out to the geographical distribution now more, and how the confidence in the political institutions plays a role. Many people have pointed out to the difference between particularly Tehran and other regions, because if the gravity of the protests, if you look to 2009, Tehran was really the booming factor. And although there were now protests in Tehran as well, it wasn't that it was quiet, but it wasn't that much visible. Which factors do you think played a role in there? Is it more the state control presence, or has it also to do with class dynamics, the presence more of the middle class that has something to lose, or what other factors could explain this?
So I think this comparison with 2009 is informative. What you see in Green Movement, again, we have high participation, much higher than both Aban and Day. It's in hundreds of thousands. Day and Aban, I think, is in tens of thousands at most. But in 2009, you have higher participation in Tehran and then a few other big cities. So a lot of observers have commented on this in terms of social composition, the class composition, whether Tehran is middle class and the other cities are lower class. At least so far, I don't see compelling evidence to say that these protests are lower class and 2009 was middle class. But what we can show, and there is evidence, is this geographic difference and discrepancy. So I think a lot of the followers of Green Movement later participated in 2013. A lot of the activists in Green Movement put, I think, their support behind Rouhani. And then later, Rouhani did not deliver to a lot of those promises. So a lot of supporters took back why they supported Rouhani, said that Rouhani betrayed their promises and so on. And I think for these followers of Green Movement, or people who supported Green Movement, they have been going through some sort of political journey in terms of deciding what kind of political action they want to take with regard to the Islamic Republic and how they want to follow their political aspirations. So after 2009, I think 2013 and 2017, there was more, I think, channeling towards political participation. In Deima, I think these people were took by surprise. They didn't know what to do. They were watching the movement by surprise, both the leaders and the followers. Some of the reformists even criticized the protest in Deima, which brought a lot of backlash. In Aban also, I think they were first following. But what I think became in Aban more important than the protest was repression. I think first these people were kind of surprised, just from my observation from their online presence. And this is a group that has a lot of online presence. And then with the repression, I think what we saw was growing more sympathy towards protesters, that at least the pretext was economic, was a rise in the price of gasoline. And maybe we can see the protest that happened after Revolutionary Guards shot down the civilian airplane. There were protests in about 20 Iranian counties, mostly led by students. Students were also important in 2009 protests. So there maybe we can, I think, observe some sort of convergence. But for these groups to take contentious political action at the same time, I think that is the big question. There are some signs, but I think we still have to wait and witness what will happen next.
Thank you, Ali. So you also refer to conjectural factors, and one of these are, and this is something that comes quite clear if you look to very different countries as well. When expectations change, protests often emerge, whether it is from bad to good or good to bad. So after 2015, there were lots of expectations that the country would go forward. When that didn't happen, there was obviously lots of disillusionment and anger, which also fed into to the protests. And I want to go to Nargis because this relates to also more structural factors, the rupture between state and society. And although we shouldn't make this into an absolute factor, because throughout time, these factors change. Confidence of people in the institutions, grievances, etc. So Nargis, in your book, Iran Reframed, you explain why state and society are not homogeneous and exclusive entities, but continually interact and negotiate at the level of individuals and organizations with a variety of ideas and cultural dispositions. This is very clear when it comes to the development of nationalism, or perhaps nationalisms, we should say. So can you elaborate on how these ideological and nationalist discourses have shaped the recent protests, and how the state has actually tried to craft actively new forms of nationalism?
Sure. Thanks so much, Peyman, for that question. And hi, everyone. It's wonderful to see you. Thank you for having me on this great panel. It's wonderful to be back at NYU. I just wish that we were present physically. So in relation to your question, first of all, it's important to remember that it took some time for this new form of narrative of nationalism that the Revolutionary Guard and the regime developed in the aftermath of the 2009 movement. The particularities of that narrative that we saw really coalesce in the outpouring of support after the assassination of Soleimani. That took years to develop. That kind of narrative began to break apart very quickly with the downing of the Ukrainian airline on the same night that the Islamic Republic decided to respond to the killing. And for a couple of reasons, the downing of that airliner really brought back many of the fault lines that have existed in society, but that they were able to sort of bring out this new narrative as an attempt to bring some sort of social cohesion. So with the downing of the airliner, the fact that at first they lied about it, the fact that there was this breach of trust, and the fact that the types of people who were on that airplane and who were going to Canada represented, and of course there's lots of complexity in all of this, but sort of as a representation, they represented the sectors of society who had been protesting against the Islamic Republic for a long time, but especially around 2009 onwards. They were the sectors of society who were going abroad to study because they didn't see many opportunities left for them at home. They were the folks who in many ways were seen within the folks that I study and I've spent time with within the pro-regime world as being the Ghair Khodis, the outsiders to the Islamic Republic. So with the downing of that airliner and with and it coming so closely upon this assassination of Soleimani, what I've seen and what I'm going to sort of use my minutes here to talk about is the ways that they're trying to create new narratives since that time moving forward. And I do believe that they will get to a new formulations of nationalism, but it hasn't cohered yet. So what I'm going to talk about today is the different narratives that I'm seeing come out that I think are important to pay attention to. The slogans that came about in the aftermath of the downing of the airliner, with some of the small protests that happened in that time period, they were important because they harkened back to some of the 2009 slogans. And so the response to this has been sort of multi-pronged, and I see it as a very similar kind of response that they began to have in that post-2009 environment, in which they are testing out different narratives or trying to see what might stick and what might not. Some of it works a little bit better and they keep working on it, and some of it they can tell very quickly will fail. But so after January, then comes, I mean, we've had such a hell of a year. Then comes the COVID crisis in February and all of the negative media attention that Iran is getting. They were having a really, really difficult time figuring out a narrative around this. They begin to get confidence back in their ability to create unifying narratives when the COVID crisis skips over into Europe and eventually the United States. And they began to have such horrible responses across Europe and across the US. So all of a sudden, I began to see a huge outpouring of different kinds of videos, memes, social media commentary, all of the different ways in which they're active on the media sphere, which began to point to the hypocrisy of the coverage that Iran had gotten in February, once it began to be evident that other countries, including and especially Western and the US countries, were having just as difficult of a time maintaining this, a response to COVID. Following alongside that comes the George Floyd killing, the Black Lives Matter protests, and the repression of the Black Lives Matter protests. This becomes wonderful fodder for pro-regime media forces to be using this as an example of, first of all, pointing to the hypocrisy from their point of view of the United States, and especially Secretary Pompeo and the Trump administration in their responses to the repression of the Islamic Republic against protesters. So and those types of images have been played over and over and over again in these months since those protests have started. Following upon that has been the elections in the United States, and then everything that's happened here in the elections, including all of the, poking at the fact that the US calls itself a democracy, but look at everything that's happened in this election. So that is another huge point in which they have been concentrating on creating different forms of media narratives. A fourth important point is the situation in Israel. So both the weekly protests that have happened in Israel, the fact that there are regular protests happening in Israel, the fact that it's not being covered as much in Western news sources as when protests happen in Iran, this has been concentrated on a lot. The fact that because of COVID, Israel's poverty numbers are skyrocketing, unemployment numbers are skyrocketing. These are things that are consistently in the media messaging now of regime, pro-regime media. And then including things like long food lines in the United States. So these are messages of, we are hurting, but we're hurting under all of these sanctions. And look at how these countries that are constantly putting us in the crosshairs are hurting just as much. And they're the ones who want to claim that they have better systems than we do. So this is the sort of narrative that's being weaved consistently. And then a fifth is that the IRGC's projection of strength vis-a-vis the United States and Israel when it comes to all of the things that are happening under maximum pressure. So now let me take one step back really quickly. For the most part, the way that the media world of the regime in Iran works, the Islamic Republic works, is that, without being able to get into all the specificities of it, they have three main audiences. The first is the Ghair Khodi audience, those Iranians who are not supporters of the regime. And so for those is when they've tried to create these lowest common denominator narratives that would keep some kind of social cohesion together. Then there's their own base, as well as those who are adjacent to their base. So those who used to maybe be a part of their base, but have grievances now, but are still closely aligned and not too far removed. And then the third are regional allies. I'm not going to go into the regional allies here, but they've been incredibly, they have upped their game in their media narrative to their regional allies in very impressive ways over the past year and a half. But I can get to that in Q&A if anyone is interested. So overall, new narratives of nationalism are not forthcoming yet, but what we're seeing is that there's been a huge increase in critiques of the opposition as being worse and crazier than the Islamic Republic. They obviously don't need a ton of help in this regard, because one of the things that we're seeing also is that the Islamic Republic in the past 2 years under maximum pressure, past 3 years under maximum pressure, has dealt with an inundation of pretty much like the media world in Persian has received this shot of steroids and has gone into overdrive because of all of the money that's being poured in from the United States, from Israel, from Saudi Arabia, from all of these countries that are against and groups that are against Iran on an international stage. And that's being played out in a very, very effective media war on social media, on satellite television, on all of these different websites and all of that. And so they have been trying to push back against that. And some of the ways that they're doing it is by projecting the opposition as these crazies. So you may hate us, but they're crazier than we are. And as also a warning against the Syriafication of Iranian politics. And so beyond some of these things that are coming out more recently, one thing that you see more in depth is like a place like Oj Media, which is a very, very fascinating, I think, as someone who researches this, organization that basically is like the Hollywoodification of the Iranian IRGC within media in Iran. So you have places like Oj that are creating these longer lasting, or at least they're trying to create these longer lasting narratives of spy thrillers showing that, you know, Iran is under this bigger conspiracy that's happening regionally, as well as targeting the corruption of the ruling elite. So within the ranks of the pro-regime folks, and I know I'm hitting time, so I'm going to end here, but within the ranks of the pro-regime folks, you have lots of disagreements about how to create a new unifying narrative going forward. And there's a lot of emphasis on critiquing the corruption within the higher echelons of the state. And so that is going along with some of these other things that we're seeing, which, you know, pretty much at any point, there is a multi-pronged attempt by the Islamic Republic to create multiple kinds of narratives. And in effect, what it ends up doing is that what they're trying to do is similar to what Assad tried to do during the war there, is to say that you may really dislike us, but you have no idea what the opposition will bring for you. And that, in addition to all of the critiques that they're making of Israel and the United States through what is going on in these countries, is how they're trying to make it so that it doesn't incite outright radical protest against them.
Thank you, Nargis. That's excellent. What you were saying evokes a term that I have been hearing a lot when it comes to the analysis of Iran, and that's paralysis, kind of dead end of the situation, that both in terms of the balance of power between state and society, repression and the protests, but also in ideological terms, as you were referring to. Obviously, there's the state narrative, and then the opposition, the society has its own narratives. But, and I think this is a kind of common sense that there is also this feeling of paralysis, because, for instance, yes, the regime should go, there should be change, but what will that change look like? And uncertainty about that also holds back a number of people in terms of joining the protests, or at least in a very active way. So maybe that's a question that we can all take with you as we move to the second part of the conversation, because now I want to zoom out a bit and look at the debates and the questions that have emerged in the various discussions and fora in analyzing the Iranian protests, because I see at least three clear positions, although obviously there are many others, in terms of how the protests should be interpreted within the broader political constellation of Iran. So one position, and I think this was worded in a recent article by Misaf Barsa, who argues that Iran is in fact in a permanent, and I quote, pre-revolutionary situation, and that repression is the main explanation why the revolutionary explosion is delayed. The second position is very close to what Asif Bayat has pointed out in terms of the protests in Iran, but also in the region and globally. That the concepts of revolution and reform, this dichotomy doesn't catch the dynamics of the new protest, and that it's better to talk maybe about a revolution as a way to understand the new dynamic of the protest. And the third position is that the increasing number of protests in Iran should be interpreted as a sign that contentious politics is becoming part of the political routine in Iran. So rather than a sign of radical rupture, we are seeing signs of routinization of protests. And I'm sure the reality is much more complex and there are all positions in between. But I think these are three positions that give a chance for us to reflect on what is happening if we zoom out from the politics.
I think one issue I have with these different categories of permanent, pre-revolution, revolution, my problem is that they are trying to classify this protest based on their consequences that we don't know, and it might change throughout different stages. For example, if we think, is this a revolution? It has not been a revolution, but maybe we think this will bring a revolution later. I prefer just to analyze them as what they have been so far. They have been waves of protest faced with severe government repression, and calling something permanently being pre-something else, I don't know, it's a little bit tautological or paradoxical. All revolutions are supposed to overcome repression. There is no revolution that repression is completely off and then you have the revolution. It's a dilemma for revolutionaries to figure out. I think I will stop there because there are
great, Ali. That would be usually my response as a historian, but I'm happy as a sociologist to have this response against generalizations as well. So, Nargis, do you have a...
I just have something really quick I'll add to what Ali just said, which is that in addition to not finding these categories really useful at the, right now to think through what's going on in Iran or even to predict social movements elsewhere, is I think another thing that we have to keep in mind and sort of maybe even add to Bayat's critique and the ways in which he dealt with what was going on in Egypt specifically, is that the way in which the media environment works today, the way in which the Trump administration utilized the media environment, both for Iran, Venezuela, and Cuba, the three main places that they were trying to induce some kind of regime collapse or regime change, first of all, has shown us how incredibly quickly discourses can change in the new technology that we are dealing with, and how incredibly siloed our information spheres can be. And so because of the way the algorithms on these platforms work, because of the way in which we engage with all of this stuff, we can become very, very siloed in even the types of information that we're receiving from the very same society in which all of us live in. And what that's doing is that when folks know how to utilize these things correctly, or in the most effective ways possible, then what it ends up producing is situations that are very different from the late 1970s, situations that are very different from the, even from a few years ago. And so this is what I will say makes it really difficult to understand. People are very, very mad at what's going on in Iran, are very disillusioned at what's going on. But whether that actually turns into something that brings people into the streets and that calls for a radical transformation of politics is really something that I think we don't know, and that these types of media technologies actually favor the state rather than favor protesters because of their surveillance capacities and because of the way in which those who have resources at their disposal can shift narratives very quickly.
No, thanks. And I think that's an important addition, because the times that I have been to Iran in the past, I often heard from Iranians, like, is it true that the French government is on the verge of collapse? Because, the media would always show only the protests in France. And so it is, I think, an important note to make that, societies are much more complex, and sometimes some section of the population is in protest, and how far that goes is something to gauge and to research well before jumping to quick conclusions. I have lots of other questions to pose to you, but I know there are questions from the audience as well. So I want to go to Arang now, who has been going through the questions and who can maybe pose some of those to the panelists.
Sure, thank you, Peyman. So thank you. There's many questions in the chat, and for those of you who have additional questions, please feel free to add to the list. We'll do our best to get through as many of them as possible. What I thought I'll do is I'll go through two at a time, and the panelists can respond to them. You don't feel obliged to respond to them. Some of these are very directed to specific people. So I'll go two at a time, and then we'll go down the list. But the first comment was from Jonathan Sofer, who asks many questions, actually. So I'm just going to take one of the several questions that he or she articulated. And that was a question about trying to situate Iran's social movements or protest movements in relationship to the rest of the Middle East, and specifically the Arab uprisings of 2011 and afterwards. So if any of you have any thoughts on how to think about Iran's protest cycles in relationship to regional dynamics, that would be interesting. And let me turn to the second question, and then I'll let you guys respond to that. The second question is directed at Ali Kadivar, and it's someone who seems to have read your article in Foreign Affairs and asks, his name is Sohail Janissari, and he writes, in the Foreign Affairs article, they didn't differentiate between cities based on intensity or number of protests in each. There was an apparent difference between cities in intensity, where some cities had a lot more protests and some had less. And he's wondering, have you done a deeper analysis on the data to see if their results hold also for cities with bigger numbers of protests or more intense levels of protest? Okay, so the first question about Iran's protests in relationship to regional dynamics, to Arab uprisings. Any one of the three, if you would like. Does anyone would like to make any comments about thinking about beyond Iran?
If I can maybe jump in, I think the relationship between the Iran protests and the Middle East, the region, also points out to really the difficulty of creating sustainable change, because there is the danger of a methodological nationalism here, that we really think within the framework of Iran, instead of also placing the possibilities of change within the more global transformations. So to be concrete, I think one of my colleagues who studies also the Arab revolt always points this out, is the importance of unemployment in all of these countries. So the youth participation is very important. And the point is, what is going to give this a solution? What real perspectives have people in front of them in terms of achieving real improvements? Because the models that are being imposed usually in the region are those of neoliberal reforms and kind of integration within the world economy. But there we also see really the limitations of that project, of elites around the army, for instance, and kind of private sector that actually benefit from authoritarian policies within a free market politics, because they still really need the state to compete on the global market, etc. So I just, that might sound a bit pessimistic, but I really want to also bring out the difficulties, the more structural difficulties that are there if we think of in which direction can these movements evolve, and what kind of real obstacles that are not only rooted in Iran or in Egypt or anything else, but really in the global political economy as well, in terms of, and on the positive side of that is, I think this is a problem that we are confronted with everywhere. So you also see the possibility of the emergence of solidarity within the region, between the different movements, but also within, Western countries with these movements, because on that global level, people are also confronted with quite similar problems. Although, of course, the national and local contexts are very important as well.
Okay. Ali, would you like to take the question about the variation across cities?
Sure. Yes. So I tried also, And after that piece published, I looked further into that analysis. So some of the factors that we highlight there, they lose their statistical significance when you account for intensity, but the direction of the influence stay the same. But the factors I emphasized today, population and electoral turnout, these stay significant and same direction. So these are some robust findings that across different models, we see that lower turnout, electoral turnout in 2017 was associated with higher likelihood of protest and more protest during the protest in Aban. I can also respond to another question that was asked for me.
Should you want to? Do you also want to say anything about the relationship between Iran and the region and Nargis as well? If you have any comments, we can turn to you briefly too.
I can highlight one similarity, and that is what has been described as the leaderless character of these movements, that there has not been a formal organization that at least coordinate this protest across different places. So we have in Tunisia, in Egypt, this has been described as leaderless. In Egypt, I think digital media played a significant role, and we have this in Iran. Although when you look specifically at each cases, there are differences in the details. For example, in Tunisia, it starts leaderless, but then the major labor union in the country gets involved, and I think that was a game changer in Tunisia. In Egypt also, there were some activists on the ground that were using digital media. This is again different from Daymah, when you have some expats in exile sending a lot of the content about a protest. And that I think probably explained part of the differences in terms of outcome. There was also a question about if there is any ethnographic account of whether Iranians buy into the monarchist narrative. So actually, Narges has written a great article about this, about the media presence of monarchists, and I should applaud Narges because she was one of the few people who has paid attention to this. And I organized a panel at Mesa a few years ago that Arang was on it, but also from NYU, Mehdi Faraji was on it, who wrote an ethnographic account about Qom. And I remember from our conversation that he said his interlocutors that participated in those protests also were the consumers of TV channels such as Manoto or some of these other oppositional accounts that have pro-monarchist tendencies.
Yes, let's turn to Nargis, because I think this question from Professor Nahid Siamdous was directed to the whole panel, but in particular, Nargis. Do you have any comments, and maybe you want to share some of the insights from your article, Nargis?
Sure. So I didn't do my ethnographic research was not on the monarchist sort of narratives, but I saw the types of effects that it was having while I was doing my research. And part of it is looking at, I don't know how widespread it is because I haven't done the research on it in that way, but the narrative is very much strengthened through places like Manoto and other satellite television stations. It's now, I think what's fascinating about now and the types of changes that have happened since I wrote that article, I think maybe 2 years ago, is that is all of the different social media accounts that have been further strengthened under Trump to further propagate that sort of narrative. And so I don't think that it's necessarily, I don't think it has as yet very strong roots or has developed strong roots, but it is pretty widespread because of the consistency of it, because of the way in which it's tied into a certain kind of nostalgia and a certain kind of cool of certain aspirations about a particular kind of being Iranian that folks may feel like they cannot be under the Islamic Republic or under certain faces of the Islamic Republic. And so I think it holds power because of that, but I can't really answer about how far it's been or how far reaching it is. The other thing I wanted to say about the Arab Spring protest question is that I'm looking at all of these questions from the point of view of the state and the military, not from the point of view of protesters. But one of the things that I will say when it comes to those protest movements is the ways in which the state is also very much paying attention to what is happening in these other spaces and looking at the ways in which the social media is being utilized, as well as the ways in which outside states or actors are trying to utilize social media to also shift narratives within a state. And so because of this, again, I think the Islamic Republic was able to respond differently in what happened in 2017, 18, and 19 in Iran because of the way that certain factors within it are very much studying what is happening in other parts around the region when it comes to protest movements.
Let's, I'm going to pick up a question, a comment by Professor Kamran Amin. He asks a set of interwoven questions. Let me just try to tease out one that maybe we could address. He writes, the Islamic Republic had pretty, the Islamic Republic has had pretty robust commitments to subsidizing and resourcing its most likely supporters as a hedge against popular revolts. Are we seeing, he's wondering, are we seeing a waning of direct state support to official and semi-official groups? If so, that would certainly help explain the observations regarding a more widespread lack of faith in the Islamic Republic's institutions, and sounds like Iranian civic society more generally. So if I can put a gloss on that. So the question is that maybe in fact some of these protesters are groups and communities, social sectors that historically, let's go back to the 1980s, 1990s, would have been beneficiaries of some of this targeted patronage and support. And if any of you have thoughts on that or evidence to either support or challenge that sort of line of analysis, that we'd be interested.
Arang, I can give it a try. So I do think, I mean, I referred to this in my brief introduction as well, that, you know, there is an unraveling of the social contract that was in place in the 1980s and maybe early 1990s. The gradual introduction of market reforms, precarization of labor, privatizations, etc. I think that has definitely kind of undermined the social support that was in place in the post-revolutionary decade. So we have seen a gradual undermining of that. I'm a bit careful about this rhetoric of buying off people in terms of kind of patronage. I think that has been definitely also in place, targeted groups that are receiving assistance. I think that has been in place. Maybe it has become more limited. Nevertheless, I think the other side of it is the welfare politics of the Islamic Republic. Again, within a regional context, if you look to the number of people who have insurances and so on, I think that is still in place, and that's more general than the targeted groups that Cameron is maybe referring to. But you know, if there is public debt, and if there are sanctions and there are a reduction of GDP, etc., obviously it becomes more difficult for the government to pay for those as well. Arang, if there are no interesting questions, I have a question for the panelists, but go ahead. I see you have probably one.
I did, I think she's left the meeting. I was gonna, well, let me skip. Let me ask, there are several questions. So let me ask one. I'm trying to find the questions that are not just directed to one individual so we can have it open to others. But go ahead, Peyman, ask your question and I will just tell the panelists there are a number of very specific questions directed to you individually that you may want to look at. But go ahead.
But if you have them, Arang, go ahead. If you have them.
Okay, so I have one general question here that says, what are your thoughts on the ethnic or demands of ethnic groups such as Kurds, Turks, Baluch, and so on and so forth for independent separation from Iran in light of the 2019 protests? Do you think that there is a chance for such separation, or should there be regime change, I think is what they meant to say? and how are such demands perceived by the Iranians inside the country more generally? So if any of you have looked at the question of political protests specifically around autonomy, the rights of ethnic minorities, and even demands for separation and independence.
Does any of you want to?
I can make a small comment. I think the ethnic politics in Iran is very understudied. So there is not a lot of evidence based on which we can discuss, for example, ethnic roots of these two waves of protest. There is, I mean, I'm working on it, but it is hard. There's not a lot of sources to gather for a nationwide data set, for example. But I can talk based on observation on social media. I think this kind of conversation have intensified. For example, over recent conflict about Karabakh, we had Iranian Azeris going debating with other Iranians over social media about which part belongs to Azerbaijan, to Iran, to Armenia, what should happen. So this is becoming, I think, a part of public discourse. And I can't for sure, I cannot predict what is going to happen if there is going to be a regime change again, because there are some activists and organizations that speak for these issues, but there are also a lot of people who we don't know what kind of positions they would take, because there is not enough freedom to study them or for them to voice their opinion on the matter. But what we can look at, for example, what happened after 1979 revolution, which until the fall of monarchy, we didn't see ethnic character in terms of protest. Courts protested, but it was after the fall of monarchy that we have demands for autonomy, for example. In Kurdistan, there were the demands, different type of demands for autonomy or recognition of right in Gombad Kavus or in Baluchistan. And if there is some sort of political transition, I think those sorts of demands will emerge. And I think it is important for different political groups to think about Iran's future in terms of engagement of different ethnic groups, Iranians who speak different languages, and some sort of grappling with this question about ethnicity. Do we have ethnic discrimination? If we have it, to what extent, in what aspect? Is it political? Is it economic? Is it social? I think we just need more conversation on this topic, and more also engagement from activists, from scholars, and from observers. So I think there are more questions than answers, at least on my side.
Okay, let me ask another question from the chat. This is from Mohammed Sayedi. It's directed to Ali Kadivar, but I think all four of you may want to speak to it. He writes, I was in the street both in Alban and Day of the last couple of years, just to observe the behavior of the protesters. I saw a lot of people who were looking at the protests and silently walking off without showing any interest in it. I'd like to know why this kind of political behavior has been widened during the last decade, especially after the protests in 2009. Why does it seem that there is an obvious incuriosity about change through protests? How do you analyze that?
So I think the repression has had a big, it's a big factor in all of this. The very real repression, the types of things that have come out about what's happened in the prisons, the long sentences that some protesters receive. I think that that's contributed to this notion of, and if I do it, what will ultimately change? And then I think the other part is this narrative that has not only been part of it is organic, but a lot of it is sort of led by the state. And there's been a lot of resources poured into it, which is the narrative of fearing of Iran becoming Syria. And so I think that we can't dismiss that, because that is something that it comes out not only in the formal channels of state media, but it comes out in lots of informal channels as well. It's a very real concern, but it's also sort of used as a scare tactic that is not just about Syria, but it's sort of pointing to a lot of the countries around the region as falling into states of instability. And so I think that that's is also used as a way to deter, especially protests that are just about protest itself, without the actual sort of strategic demands that a wider movement might be demanding.
Arang, I just want to come back very briefly, because I know we have to end at around 2. More to the ethnic question that was posed earlier, because I just want to stress that when looking to these protests, there are so many different aspects that we should be still researching and exploring. And the ethnic dimension is definitely one of them. In one of the research I did was that there is a huge overlap between the provinces in which poverty is the most extreme, and also those are obviously the peripheral kind of provinces, if you think of Kurdistan, Khuzestan. But it's not only the socioeconomic factor that is attached to kind of ethnic communities, but also discrimination, to be honest. And that's very visible also when you look not only at the causes of the protest, but also in the repression. So let's not forget that one of the most vicious acts of violence emerged in Khuzestan. Hundreds of people were killed there. So in the Kurdish areas where the kulbars, precarious laborers have been targeted in the last years, you saw also lots of kind of strikes along the protests and lots of grievances that really come into play. So I don't know, and I don't think that has to be attached to the separatism question. Obviously, there are groups that will come up with this claim, but I think this is more broadly a kind of a demand of equality, not only in socioeconomic terms, but also in terms of ethnic divisions and differences.
So if I respond to that question about apathy, first I would say the person who asked the question is in a better position to answer it. If they were on the street on day and Albans, I would like to hear more about their observations. I use here a method that I can do from this far to find out something. And I think this is a collective effort for us to learn more about these waves of protest. But I also don't know if we have had increasing apathy or not. In many other counties that these protests happen, these are new things. So I don't think people in those Shahristan or counties are used to see this kind of protest and know from the beginning they should join to them or what, because they don't know who's behind it, or like what kind of demands they have. And I think the kind of that probably explain why these protest phases were both short and they were unsuccessful in the sense that they were repressed. They did not join to a bigger movement or a type of concrete political change. So the length of if they had lasted for longer, probably more people would have joined. Or if in Tehran more people would have gathered in the first place, there would be potential for other people to join. Tehran is I would guess this person who asked the question saw this in Tehran, or correct me if I'm wrong, but Tehran is a city of millions of people. So if some protests happen and many people don't join it, I don't think that is the surprising part. If people are joining, we should ask why these people are joining. So at this point that protests have been small and are facing repression, major question is that why these few people join and yes, after usually movements pass the critical mass and become too big, then we assume this is the automatic thing that everyone is joining them. But at this point, I think the question is that why the people who joined did join these movements.
Okay, so in classic academic fashion, we'll end with the question. which seems appropriate. We know far less than we actually know at this moment, and we hopefully, as a group, as a collective, with all this large audience that we had for today's events, we should continue investigating, asking questions, reformulating our questions in more precise ways to understand what's happening in Iran, but as it's related to global processes that we are all experiencing.